Now, a few weeks ago, I was down in Cornwall for a few days for a very short trip, not a photography trip, an actual holiday. And whilst I was there, I realised that this is what photography looks like for most people. It's not planning your photography around ideal shooting conditions. In fact, most of the photography typically takes place during unfavourable conditions, the middle of the day where you're getting harsh light, you're not necessarily going to get up for a sunrise, and you might be busy during a sunset. Now, being a professional photographer, I of course took a camera with me. I took this Lumix S5 II, but it actually stayed in the bag for the majority of this trip. I only used it a handful of times, and instead I took the opportunity to shoot film on my Canon AE-1. I took one roll of Kodak Gold 200, and in this video I'm going to share the photos, but more importantly share the very important lesson that shooting these 35mm film photos taught me about photography. Now, one of the biggest motivators for me to shoot film whilst on holiday is because it allows me to have a nice time, be present in the experience, and not be too engrossed in the image making process. And that's kind of the first lesson, is that in order to get good photos, you have to experience and be present in that location. You have to be observant, and you have to know your surroundings. You have to be aware of what's happening around you. And it's really, really hard to do that if you're constantly looking at the back of your camera, reviewing photos, or just thinking about photos all of the time. Sometimes you just have to put the camera down and just exist in a place. Sometimes we do need to take that opportunity to spend a few minutes sitting in a cafe window, sitting on a bench with a coffee and just watching the world go by, because that allows you to actually experience the place and decide what in that place is interesting you the most. For me, that's a far better approach, and also a far nicer way to experience photography than the whole spray and pray approach, where you're just taking hundreds of photos because in a law of averages, at least a couple will probably turn out half decent. And especially when you're shooting film, because of the cost involved, I find that slowing down and taking a much more considered approach actually benefits the overall photographic experience. It all comes down to two things: intention and consideration. What's compelling you to grab your camera and take an image? And is that scene or that subject actually worth taking a photo of? Remember, just because we can take a photo, it doesn't always mean that we should. I can tell that this approach worked well for me on this trip because of the 35 exposures that I took on that roll of Kodak Gold 200. From the scans that I received, there are at least 20 photos that I think are half decent and that I actually really like for one reason or another. So let's dive into some of these photos and let me talk about why I like them. Now, this first location was somewhere that we both really wanted to visit. It's a National Trust site. We're National Trust members, so anywhere where we can get free parking or free admission, we're always going to gravitate towards it. And this location is kind of quintessentially Cornish. It's so indicative of the Cornish landscape, and it's the Crown Mines, which are the old tin mines along the rugged coastline, steeped in history, dramatic seascapes, dramatic landscapes, just everything that I love. Regardless of if I had a camera with me or not, this is a location that I just really wanted to see. And there's always a very typical composition that I've seen photos of from this location. I think the National Trust actually use it as their image for this location. And it's just a photo of these two tin mines that are in this little cove. But this is actually the least interesting photo that I took in this location. Now, right near the car park, there is a much more modern example of this kind of like mining landscape. And it was a location that just made me ask so many questions, because all of the kind of tourist board information is all around the really historic mines, the old tin mines. And there really wasn't much information about this little set of abandoned buildings and infrastructure. This wide shot of the chimney stack was a really good start. You've got the blue sky, but you've also got the chimney with that brickwork and those red stripes that were really contrasting against that colour blue. And I mean, that's the aesthetic taken care of. That is a pleasing colour combination that aesthetically looks nice, but there's also the story. And that's where the composition really comes into play, because I think most great photos have those two elements. They have a pleasing aesthetic with an interesting story or an interesting perspective. In this photo, I love how you've got that metal frame coming in from the right-hand side, and it kind of frames this boarded up door or window. And because you can't see what that metal structure is, and because that door is kind of boarded up, it just makes you ask a few questions. It feels like the story is untold or unfinished, like there's more to explore outside of the confines of that frame. So that was a very intentional choice for me for this particular photo. This second image adopts a similar mindset. We've got the aesthetic taken care of, which is the complementary tones of the greens, because you've got the green grass, complemented this time with more of the red and sort of like orangey tones of the brickwork and these really rusted wheels. You know, red and green are kind of opposites on the colour wheel, so they always look quite harmonious together. But also this particular composition just really made me ask the question of, you know, what are these wheels a part of? What were they used for, and why are they lent up against this fence? That was the thing, or that was the question rather, that I was asking myself before I even went to grab my camera. Now, you'll have to take my word for it when I tell you that the subject of this next photo was not something that I intentionally placed in this way in this particular scene. Compositionally, this photo is all about mysteries. The aesthetic kind of takes care of itself because there's not an awful lot of colour or tonality in this particular shot. It makes me ask the question of why is there this old computer keyboard, and it might not even be a computer keyboard, I'm not entirely sure what it was, which just further adds to the mystery, I suppose. But why was it left on this doorstep, you know, exposed to these harsh elements right along the coast? These are all the things that I'm thinking as I'm walking around this location. And to go back to what we were saying earlier about intention and about consideration, these are the considerations that I'm making. These are the questions that I'm asking myself. And it's only when I've satisfied myself with those responses is there something here that's compelling enough to take a photo? And is this thing that I want to take a photo of actually a worthy photo compositionally, or is it a story that's worth sharing? It's only when those two criteria are satisfied that I eventually take the photo. And so far, this location and the photos that I've shown are where those two criteria have been met. And quite often when I'm thinking about the composition, I'm often composing the image to try and convey these questions and these feelings that I have about a particular scene. Like in that last scene with the computer and the crack in the door, you know, it's thinking about that mystery, the questions that I'm asking myself of why is this keyboard on this step, and why is there a crack in that door? Being able to compose it so both of those elements are visible is something that I think is so important to understand in ourselves, and it's something that I actually mentioned in this week's podcast episode. Having this kind of internal monologue and asking yourself these questions, I think, is such an important part of the photographic process. It goes beyond aesthetic and, you know, that idea of story. It's about trying to convey your own interests in the work that you make. Now, this final image from this location is a wide shot of the entire site. I felt it added context to the previous images because now you understand the environment in which those photos were taken, but I also liked the balance created by the chimney and the metal framework. Evenly spaced, but with consideration to the edges of the frame. Same with the telegraph pole and the cows in the field. They're all considerately and intentionally framed by the metal structure. They're not obscured, and they all have room within the negative space of that structure. Now, it would have been so easy to ruin this photo, and this is why observation and taking the time to really observe your scene before you even grab your camera is so important. You need to decide what you want to include and what you want to exclude from your frame. Now, with this photo, you'll notice that there's a farmhouse near the left-hand side of the frame, and I could have really easily cut that in half or obscured that if I wasn't paying close attention to this composition. And to the left of the modern chimney stack, you'll also see the silhouette of one of the old mine shafts. Again, it would have been so easy to obscure that with the chimney, which would have been fine, but what would have been sinful would have been to just partly obscure that. You either need to have that in the photo or you need to exclude it. And the placement of that in the negative space was just really important, not just compositionally, but also because it just speaks to the history and the scale of this landscape. Now, the next location that we went to was the southernmost point of the British mainland. It was right down on the Lizard Peninsula, and it's a really, really beautiful coastal environment. There's some really lovely sea stacks, there's a lot of seabirds, and there was a lot of people with their binoculars all looking out to sea, looking at these stacks. But again, similar to the other location, the thing that was really interesting to me in this particular location was this really old and disused lifeboat station. Immediately, what I was noticing, or I guess what drew me to that immediately, was firstly its kind of position within that particular landscape. Obviously, because of the nature of a lifeboat station, the ramp kind of points into the sea. And as I was looking at this scene with the dramatic coastline sort of wrapping around it, it created just like a really nice leading line into this really lovely coastal landscape. And the other thing that was really compelling me to take a photo here was, again, thinking about the aesthetic and thinking about colour contrast. You've got the really lovely blue tones of the water and this old kind of patinaed lifeboat station with all of its kind of like orangey yellow brickwork and all the metalwork which was rusted from probably decades of being battered by the coast, just created a really nice sense of harmony. And that made me want to consider taking that photo. But was it worth taking a photo? And when I think about the history of this particular landscape, you know, with it being the southernmost point of the UK mainland, and with that lifeboat station now no longer in use, it's got a sign on the actual station itself which says 1914, so, you know, this is over 100 years old. I think that in itself is an interesting enough story to include in a photo. So I spent a little bit of time finding some compositions and finding some interesting ways to frame this structure. Obviously, we've looked at that wide shot, which I think is really good at establishing the context of the location, but what I really liked was finding more interesting ways to frame the story, I suppose, of this particular lifeboat station. I really like this photo, which kind of frames these really kind of jaggedy rocks out in the middle of the ocean. And you think about lifeboats and you think about, you know, when they're used, and it's often when people are in distress, and I just think, you know, if a boat had moored itself on those rocks, that's where this lifeboat station would have really come into its own. So framing those rocks within the confines of the structure of the station itself, I think was an interesting perspective. But also you can see, because of the side light here, that you can see all the patina and like the graffiti on the wall of the station. And that in itself, I think, came together really nicely. So I will leave the video here for today. Stay tuned for a slideshow of some more photos from this little trip. If you did enjoy this video, if you've enjoyed the photos, do consider giving the video a thumbs up, and I'd love it if you could hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you get notified when new videos go live. As always, guys, thanks so much for all the support. Thanks for tuning in, and yeah, let me know what you think of these photos down in the comments.